Hello, everyone. I'm super excited to be here today because I get to talk all about memories, hooks, skills, commands, pre-training, RAG, context window, agents, guardrails, multi-agent orchestration. I'm kidding. I know there's a lot of hype culture around AI right now with a lot of terms being just thrown around, but my focus today is to talk about how you can use agents in your data science workflows. And just to clarify, Akriti gave a beautiful presentation on production agents, but when I talk about agents, I'm referring to coding agents that you can use while doing data science, especially in an environment of a team where possibly most of you are collaborating within a Git repository. And I like to use the metaphor of an intern here because you don't expect an intern to start working on your code base from day one, building data pipelines and building machine learning models, correct? So I like to think of AI the same way. You can't expect it to work if you're not setting it up for success to begin with. That means providing the right guidance, providing the right infrastructure, and also having a lot of patience to begin with. So the way I like to think about it, it's really a three-step framework. You start by onboarding. An agent is only as good as the harness you build around it. The harness is essentially anything, the tools, the system, the context, basically everything around the model that the model can use to perceive the environment and take action. And to build out a good harness, the first step and the most important step is to build the right context. So if you take one thing away today from this talk, it should be to start building out a rich context hub for your agents. And this could mean everything that your agent needs to understand everything about your tables, like your table definitions, schema documentation, column definitions, even the acronyms that live in your head rent free, and even the business model for that matter. The difference between an agent that has all this context versus one that has none is literally night and day. Once you complete that step, the next action item would be to create an agents.md file. Now, this acts as the core instruction file for your agent. This is where everything important to your agent is where you can put everything important to your agent. So for example, the high-level architecture, the tech stack, or even the critical dependencies that are important for anyone working within that Git repository. But one mistake I see a lot of people doing in this part is including everything in this agents.md file, when in fact it should be treated more like an index file, or rather a map to all the different documentation that you have lying around. And this is important because every token in your context window is precious, and the more unnecessary information you feed it, the worse the agent performs because of context overload. So all the context that you built out in step one, all of them can live in their individual markdown files, and then agents.md can pull it in as necessary, as you can see in this example, where I'm asking about a customer pattern, and the agents.md has an instruction to use the customer's documentation when there's a prompt about customers, and it conveniently pulls in that information and responds. Now, if you're thinking, geez, Nandita, that's a lot of work. You got to build all this context, and then you got to build an agents.md. Let me reassure you that this is also something you can delegate to the agents. In fact, agents probably write better instructions for agents than humans do. So I would start by asking the agent to do a thorough scan of my Git repository and start building out that documentation. And I will share a Git repo at the end of this talk where I have provided some prompts you can use to start seeding the documentation for your repository. But it's basically something the agents can do itself. Your job then is only to vet it for accuracy. And if your team uses third-party tools like Confluence or SharePoint, you can also connect your agents to retrieve all this information from there to build out this documentation. The aim is just to build out the documentation using agents. Okay, so now we have onboarded our agent. The next step is to coach it. We coach the agent to do our boring, repetitive, manual tasks that we don't enjoy doing as much. And one way to do that is using skills. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the concept of skills, it's basically a way of giving expertise to your agent in certain tasks. So you could have a skill to do exploratory analysis on your data. You could have another one to debug your pipeline. Basically, anything that can be broken down into some actionable steps. And the cool thing about skills is that it's a very efficient way of organizing your information. Think about a bookshelf. You can only see the title and the author of the books from this view, right? Similarly, an agent only ever sees the name and a one line description of the skill. And when it recognizes a prompt that needs the skill to be used, that's when it pulls all the surrounding information from the skill and pulls it into the context. And again, this is great because it essentially saves your context window. So now if you feel comfortable with skills, you can move on to some other steps like hooks. These are scripts that can be triggered to run before or after an agent action. Or you can also use sub-agents, which are just separate AI agents that have its own context window. And if you want, you can also have it use a completely different model too. One of my favorite use cases of a sub-agent is the verification sub-agent. So after your main agent does the analysis, you can dispatch the sub-agent, verification sub-agent, to check the analysis that it has done to make sure that the output is correct and that it hasn't just made up numbers and put random numbers in your charts, which we all know it is capable of doing. So if you got on board and coach done, now we learn how we manage our agents. And managing is basically trying to understand its quirks. How do you work with your agent? Trying to understand how to work with it so that you can produce the best outputs. And one way to do that is using this three-step loop: plan, execute, verify. Planning, you start by planning and discuss the approach with your agent first. Once you lock in the plan, that's when you hand it off to the agent for the execution. So you just let the agent build at this point, and then your job is to review. And then verify, you check the output, check the numbers, check that it makes sense. And I do want to spend a little bit more time on planning stage because arguably this is one of the most important parts of the session. This is so you can start. The general recommendation is just to give a really verbose first prompt and basically just dumping everything on your mind to this particular in this prompt for your agent. And the one mistake I see a lot of people doing here is that they delegate this step to the agent itself, which is maybe not the best idea because the real approach should be to really think through the design choices, the architectural choices, the patterns you want to follow, all the little nuances, and then asking your agent to challenge these thoughts. Ask it to provide pros and cons of your approach and maybe even suggest alternatives to the approach you're thinking of. And that's kind of where the model really shines. It may not be the best at coming up with its own ideas, but it does a really good job at figuring out all the ways your ideas can go right or wrong. And the last thing is also always ending your prompt or planning prompt or any prompt by saying ask me clarifying questions. So when the agents don't have enough information, they default to assuming. And that's the last thing you want. But adding this one line prompts the agent to stop and interrupt you when it's confused. And that's what you want. You want the agent to be crystal clear with your intent. And remember, it's a collaboration. There are places where the AI shines, like coding, debugging, documentation, but there are also places that us humans shine, at least right now, like choosing the right metric or maybe identifying biases in the model that's altering the result. To conclude, I'd just like to say that we are in a fast-paced environment right now, so it makes sense that we use it so we're not surprised by the capabilities tomorrow. Yeah, feel free to scan this QR code. The README should have enough details to get you started on seeding the documentation and other skills. But otherwise, feel free to get coffee with me and talk, if you want to talk more in depth about any of this. Thank you.